I do want to welcome all of you to our webinar today, Reimagine Your Distance and Blended Learning Plans. As I mentioned, I'm Deborah Hargrove, the Managing Director of TCAL. And we've got two guests with us this afternoon. The first is Lori Slayton. Lori is our Program Support Specialist of the Texas Workforce Commission, and she is our Lead Support Specialist for Distance Learning. When John Stevenson retired, Lori took that reign and is pushing forward with some great ideas. So I want to welcome her, and I'm going to give her the opportunity now to welcome our presenter. Lori?
Hi, good afternoon. As Deb said, I'm Lori Slayton. I work for the Adult Education and Literacy Division of the Texas Workforce Commission. I just recently assumed the position of the DL guy here at State Office. I'm really happy that we're able to bring you this opportunity today on working with your local distance learning plans. This webinar is part of a larger vision to bring more energy and focus, more best practice sharing, et cetera, to AEL distance learning. And so let's see, about those plans. AEL grantees are required to develop and maintain a DL plan for their local site. And for the first time ever, TWC is collecting these plans on April 15th. And so in thinking about that, how we could best help you all with submitting a great DL plan, Deb and I agreed that only the best and brightest presenter for this subject would do. So we reached out to our colleague, Dr. Jen Vanek, and she agreed to work with us today to bring you this webinar. Jen is the Director of Digital Learning and Research at the EdTech Center of World Ed, and I'm really happy to welcome Jen and turn it over to you, Jen.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for that very kind introduction. It's great to be with the great teachers from the state of Texas. I'm looking at the participant list and see lots of familiar names, so glad to be on the call again with you. So as Lori said, the goal of the webinar here is to get you to think about some innovative ideas that you might integrate into your distance learning plan, your site implementation plan, ahead of the mid-April deadline. So we're going to, basically I'm going to be sharing some examples of implementation that I've seen as I've worked over the years and sort of stagger them with the different elements of the plan that you have to create, so you can see where this might fit. We'll be entertaining questions along the way, and then at the end we'll be sharing some more PD resources for you that might also be useful. So I've worked in the field of adult literacy, specifically adult ESL, since, I don't know, a long time, like the mid-90s, and moved into distance learning work in the early days, right after what was OVE released their first guidance document on distance learning, and I was working in the state of Minnesota at St. Paul Adult Basic Education, and we were helping construct the distance learning policies for the state of Minnesota. I did a little research and heard about Project IDEAL, which was started by my mentor, Dr. Jerry Johnston, with whom many of you are familiar. Minnesota promptly joined what was then Project IDEAL and remained a member until today. Jerry resigned or retired. He retired after a very fruitful career several years ago, and we moved IDEAL Consortium, rebranded to reflect some of the changes that we implemented, and we moved that to World Education. So IDEAL Consortium is based on the solid work of Dr. Jerry Johnson while he was at the University of Michigan, and has been continuously updated through my own research and through the conversations that I have with people all across the country as I try to glean effective practice. So we are a consortium. I facilitate a consortium of state leaders, Lori and Deb among them, and others on this call. And we really do try to connect effective practice across this consortium so that people aren't recreating the wheel. And through those conversations then, and through guiding many states through professional development that actually culminates in a site plan, a distance learning site plan, I've gotten a glimpse at some very interesting and innovative ideas, which I am sharing with you today. So to get started, I am just curious. There's no wrong answer to this question. Can you raise your hand, your digital hand, and let me know if you've seen your site plan recently? Yeah, it looks like about half of the people have seen the plan, which is great. That's wonderful. So, and if you haven't yet seen your plan, I think maybe if you're keeping a to-do list for today, one of the things you should add to it is figure out who has your plan and how you can get access to it, so that you can have some input on the updates that need to be made. So for those of you who have seen the plan, if you could respond in the chat. Just think about these questions for a second, and then let's respond in chat first. How is your current implementation plan working? And what is really clear to you? Is there anything that's really clear to you that needs to change in your plan? So I'm gonna pause, literally pause here, mute myself, let you think about this question for a minute or two, and then chat a response.
Maxine shares their hybrid classes are going well, but our 100% DL group needs some motivation. Definitely needs updating regarding staffing and curriculum use. We're updating it to reflect the new standards, yet we just had a new standard rollout. Yep. We need to integrate more hybrid, Rachel says. Designate resource instructors to mentor other instructors. Amy Finley, in our case, it's very hard to say within the document who is the DL teacher because there are many across multiple sites. We're also implementing the use of coaches for this purpose. That's a great idea. It would be better to have a simpler way to report for larger organizations. Mm-hmm. Karen at McLennan, ESL students generally need motivation. Our ABE students are doing rather well. Getting them to fulfill program requirements, implement any new students. Danielle, we developed a plan. Right now, the part that is actively going well is the use of the Aztec and Burlington. Kurt Zuprine from COM, teacher training is insufficient. Much more time and effort needs to be directed towards teacher development. I'm assuming in how to be an effective online teacher. What I'm seeing, what I'm noticing right now is a lot here on teacher engagement. When I read student motivation, I think about the instructional activities that are maybe implicit within what motivates students, and then perhaps even some framing about what happens ahead of time with orientation. And it's good to see that so many people are using a hybrid model. And okay, and then this idea with instructional coaches and mentoring for teachers is interesting too. Okay, well, thanks for that. I think that's a nice level set, and it helps me understand where you are. Hopefully gets your thoughts rolling about what you want to do in the future with the plan. So when I think about a distance learning program, and I guess implicit within that, we're also going to talk about, sometimes you can substitute hybrid or blended for distance. Plans are for any form of distance learning, whether it's a hybrid or 100%. Great. So regardless, I think that it's very important to be intentional, and this deadline of plan revision for you is an opportunity for you to be really intentional and think about the way you're developing these instructional opportunities. As always, with instruction and defining instruction, it's really important to start with the actual needs of your learners and what it is you need them to accomplish through this mode of instruction on one hand, and then the resources that you know you have available to you on the other. And you need to have balance there. So you need to be realistic and innovative at the same time, so that you can move your program forward. Make sure that any ideas you have are grounded in your state policy, because that is going to actually help put some boundaries on your thinking so that your program is in line with what's allowable in your state.
And then also at the state level and with, with TCAL, know where you can find support for implementing that plan once it's written. I like to emphasize, and as Jerry Johnston did, that this is really often, if you're trying something new, it's wise to have an experimental process in mind. Target something with a small group of learners. So you can write about something in your plan, and sometimes making a wholesale change program-wide is hard. So as you're moving into new work, it's really important to start with a targeted group of learners, gather and evaluate data about your progress as you're moving into these changes, and then use whatever you learn to expand your innovation to your program as a whole. So I'm sharing this as a way to frame sort of my approach and the way I encourage you to think about your program redevelopment and the changes you might make to your program. So what I've done here is framed the rest of the slides according to the different sections of the new distance learning template that you're all going to be filling out. So we're going to go through each section, and I'll pause after each section to give you a chance to ask some questions. So essentially, this first section around recruitment is helping you decide who you're going to be working with, who you're going to be supporting, who you're going to be targeting your outreach to for recruitment into this program, where you're going to find them, and how you're going to find them. So as I said before, if you're thinking about major shifts in your program, think about a targeted learning opportunity and curriculum that you might use to fill a need, something that maybe it's a community of learners you're not quite serving within your program and you know you need to reach. Think about those characteristic skills, proficiencies of the learner who would succeed, or of that learner that you want to reach, and then figure out where you can find them. Are you going to use flyers in public places? Are you going to reboot a website, use social media? Facebook, apparently Instagram is like all the, a really important place to locate people right now. And then your partnerships with libraries, workforce development organizations, and CDOs. I'm going to show you a few examples of some fairly innovative, I think, recruitment strategies that I've noticed. The one that you see in front of you right now was a flyer that was developed for a program in Virginia that was aware that there were students who had started as homeschoolers in this very rural community who hadn't completed. And so this was a whole untapped group of demographic or group of students that they could bring into an online adult or diploma or alternative diploma or secondary diploma program. So they figured out where they could find these learners, and they created these media that they distributed to partnering organizations. And I share this because they were really thinking outside of the box about how they might boost their enrollment by thinking in a very targeted way about a group of learners that they had never served before, but they knew they would be able to serve. So that's one example. Here's another example, again, from Virginia. This is a Facebook page, and what I think is really neat here is that they have this bot set up to that engages people who are interested in conversation about the program. And so immediately they're looking. This should tell you they're looking for tech-savvy students who are already online and who know how to engage with this kind of interaction. So if you are thinking about trying to reach more tech-savvy students who might not need as much hand-holding and might be easier to support, use a tech-rich way to do that recruitment, just like this program in Virginia. Another way, you might know that you have a lot of students or a lot of people in your area who don't have home Wi-Fi, so they might be going to public places to access the internet. This is a program, again, so I just supported a group of teachers in Virginia last year, and so a lot of these great examples percolated out of their work. they have, you might know that your students are going to a particular restaurant or cafe in order to access free Wi-Fi. So how about this idea of printing out tray liners and working with these businesses to use some sort of tray liner that has information about your program. So this is something that I mocked up. This isn't an actual one that they use. But I've heard of a couple of programs doing this, one in Virginia, and then actually the first person I heard who did this was in northwestern Michigan. And they actually got McDonald's to integrate for like set period of time periodically to use their customized tray liners for people to come in so they could learn about their program. So a few ideas about reaching learners based on what you know about them and based on who you want to expand service to. Now, your plan doesn't have a separate section for screening, but there are questions kind of some in the orientation area and some in the recruitment area. And but I'm calling this out as like a separate thing to attend to because you really do need to identify learners you can successfully support and figure out who meet criteria for participation. If you're talking strictly distance learning, if you're talking about blended or hybrid scenario, you still need to identify learner needs, but rather than sort of screening people out, you might be thinking about using that information to help you understand how to support them. So when we're talking about screening, we are going to think about, whether they're academically prepared, whether they have adequate tech skills, whether they have the habits of mind to support independent, goal-driven work, and whether they have this, what I've been calling logistical readiness. That is, do they have like a quiet place and a time, an actual time to do the work? So if you attend to all those things and you keep in mind this idea that really anyone can work if they can meet the tech demands, if they have the skills and they have the support available. Like anybody can succeed learning online. There's this really excellent literature review written by Heidi Silver-Caquella and Steve Reeder. They did a survey of published research to try to determine the minimum threshold required for success learning online. And though the study's fairly dated, I think the findings hold true, and that is that anyone can learn if, where the tech demands are high, either they have the skills to meet those demands or they have extra support available. Where a learner has really high skills, you can use more demanding technology. Where you don't have a lot of support available, you need to make sure that the tech demands are low or that you're only incorporating students who won't be challenged. So if you can think about these things together, you can start to form a picture in your mind about the characteristics of a distance or blended learning scenario that would support the most, the broadest breadth of students possible. There's a program in Washington, D.C., the screenshot is lousy, but there's a program in Washington, D.C. that has taken screening very seriously. And what you can see here in this folder, sort of, is they have all of these surveys that they use in their orientation process and their screening process. So they've found psychosocial questions, they found availability questions, they have found questions that address inventory, their access to online learning, and they integrate all of these things into their correspondence with students that are exploring distance learning, so that they make sure they have adequate information to support the students and make sure that they're getting students that can succeed. Okay, so here's just diving in a little bit. Then another program has created these DL readiness surveys. This is an example I can also share with you. This is from a different program. And this one was actually, this is a screenshot of some questions from the Word doc, that they actually did this in a Google form so that they would have access to this digitally. So they the digital completion itself was part of the screening process. Okay, so then moving into orientation. So we're talking here about all of the things that you need to do to set up a learner before they even get started with instruction. Orientation should attend to these two major categories of things. It should cover goals and planning, and it should provide an orientation to the course or curriculum. I think some of the most interesting research done by Jerry in the early days when he was working with Leslie Petty, and he was working on a study funded by what was then OBE, found that attention up front to orientation had lasting input and impact on learner persistence down the road. That without orientation, it's really hard for learners to persist. And in fact, we saw that with the Exercise Communities competition. Team World Ed, I think, did really well in that competition because we set up our practitioner partners to provide adequate onboarding or orientation to any learners that they brought into using those free apps that were available. So this is something that I've seen play out time and time again. What you see on the screen here is an example from an organization in DC that's created a whole website around orientation. So students can actually go in there ahead of time and they can prepare for the orientation themselves, or teachers use this to coordinate their own orientation and engagement. And then it's also like a place for resources to be held in place so that people can consult them. Just want to cover some interesting areas or key areas that you want to make sure you hit on in an orientation section of your plan, and then I'll give you some more examples. You want to, basically I see 4 key areas here. So setting goals and expectations is very important. So you want to, that includes things like learning goals and a timeline, and then expectations for communication, like how often do you promise, are you going to promise or write in your site plan that teachers will be communicating with students, and what is expected for students to communicate back to teachers. Obviously, then we'll move down like clockwise. Technology requirements and access are really important to cover in orientation. You want to ensure students have the tech required to participate in the tools that you're going to use for instruction. And then where you notice gaps, help students figure out how to get access. You know, whether that's a list of free Wi-Fi public access points, or, you know, your lab, maybe you have a computer lab and it's open for students to do independent learning, or many programs, actually there are programs that check out hotspots. So that's definitely something you need to do. And I see you do want to do direct training on the tools, the resources, the technology resources that students are going to rely on for instruction, or that you're going to rely on for communication. Make sure that the goal of this part of orientation is to make sure that learners are ready for independent use, and that they also have adequate practice, like logging in. At St. Paul Adult Basic Ed, where I worked, we would actually have students complete like one section or unit, or like an exemplar unit within a tool or with us around them, so that they could get used to navigating. And that built confidence, so that then they were able to then do the work at home and just set them up for success from the very beginning. And then finally, you want to make sure that you're figuring out how to, touch on some of these habits or mind or soft skills. So you want to help them understand that independent distance learning requires some organizational skills that aren't required in anything else that the students do. So how are they going to set aside time for doing this work? What study habits are required, and where are they going to go if they need support? And you can use the conversation also as a time to figure out how you're going to provide that support that they might need. So before we break, I'm going to show you 3 examples of things you might include. A distance learning plan or contract is often used in an orientation session. And this one you can see clearly articulates the responsibilities of everybody involved. So The learner has responsibilities and the teacher has responsibilities. And together, if everybody works according to those responsibilities, the goal is to help the learner meet the articulated goal that's at the top of this page. You'll notice that we also used to ask the students to say where to study and when and how many hours. And this really did help set the tone from the very beginning. On the right is just a screenshot of the cover page of a PowerPoint. I've often seen PowerPoint presentations used to structure orientation sessions. And this is just really great, especially if it's made available online to students afterward so that they can remind themselves of key information that will help them succeed. This is a screenshot of a Weebly web page that a program used to store all of their orientation materials. Weebly, as you might know, is a free web tool. You can pretty easily build a website. You don't need to use Weebly. You could use, like your program website, or you could use a Google site. You could even actually probably use a system of Google file folders. But the key is that everybody who is in charge or touches learner orientation has one place to go. This is really great too if it's made transparent to learners, and you could refer them to the resource also. And I want to say one more thing about orientation before we pause for questions. I think that sometimes we take for granted, this is actually, that we learned this from the XPRIZE Communities competition. One of the things that we were taking for granted early on was that everybody would realize that you could learn on a device. And it took Miriam Peterson, who is a teacher at the Thomas Jefferson Adult and Career Education Center in Virginia. She started experimenting with like a bigger picture as part of her orientation, where she actually started orientation sessions with general conversations about the devices. So what kind of phone do you have? How do you know if you're connected to Wi-Fi? You know, conceptually, a lot of the students didn't even know what an app was. And didn't realize that they could download apps to their phone or had no idea how to go about doing that. So she started with this like background conversation that really helped make this idea of learning through an app on your phone way more concrete and less abstract. And only after she felt comfortable with the conversation, then she had students help each other downloading an app. And then after that, she had people practice. So if you would like to, if you want to bring mobile learning into your distance learning, which I highly recommend, I think the latest Pew Center research shows 97% of adults in the U.S. have a phone, a mobile phone, and all but 15% of those are smartphones. So if you're choosing distance learning products, you're going to want to make sure they're accessible on a mobile device. For your reference, basically everything I've talked about here is spelled out for you. Not the concrete examples, but the sort of background and the context, the theory, is mapped out in 2 blog posts, setting the stage for distance and blended learning and supporting distance learners from the start. I've summarized key chapters from the Ideal Distance Ed and Blended Learning Handbook in these 2 blog posts. So I'd highly, if you want to read a little bit more deeply into this, you can through these links.
You know, some folks were talking about how screening is important. It's an ongoing issue, digital literacy and tech readiness. Maxine was saying that some of her students have computers that are so old that they don't really meet the basic tech specs, and they don't find that out until after they get started. And so that's an issue of how do we get them connected with a more up-to-date computer. Ashley was talking about hotspots. When you talked about hotspots, there was a discussion on how can I find out where we can maybe get some free hotspots or check some out. And folks responded that they could get it at the local library. I don't know if you know, Jen, any other place that might check them out other than the local libraries.
Well, I know of a few ABE programs that have gotten grants and have created their own tech lending libraries with hotspots and tablets or Chromebooks. There are a number of programs in Virginia and California, and Rhode Island have all done that. Actually, in Michigan too. So this is a growing sort of movement. In fact, the state director in Virginia has guided, actually suggested that states or that programs should use innovation funds. They have a funding model that rewards progress.
You know, and Lori, feel free to pipe in here, but in a last meeting that we attended, Anson mentioned that, you know, programs are not limited anymore on a percentage of money they can spend on technology and stuff. So, you know, your program might, if you have some funds, might want to invest in a couple of Wi-Fi's or MiFi's and just check them out as a lending library.
Yeah, absolutely. And these are allowable AEL expenses, so you don't hesitate to reach out to your directors and see if there are funds available.
It looks like Everyone On. Somebody's using Everyone On. I
Yes.
think Comcast has this Everyone On program for $10 a month.
Yep, that's great. And then Rachel and some other folks were talking about the adult learning plan, the contract. You know, did it help or not help? And one of the folks replied, well, it helps because when we meet for their goals to review them, you know, we bring the contract back up. I mean, I think it takes ownership by giving them a contract. It's so official and professional that, you know, that's the way that you can use it. I did mention that we do have a similar DL plan contract in the DL3 course that we have online. Somebody talked about Wakelet, Laura and Ashley. That's a great tool for what? For a DL contract, or I'm not familiar with Wakelet.
So I thought of Wakelet when she was showing the Weebly that they were organizing the documents in. I mean, Wakelet is just another, you put them all out there, or you put all the collection of resources out there, and then you can edit it and change it as your documents are updated. But it doesn't change what the end user has to go to. They always still just go to the same website, web link. So
That's great.
Yeah.
I wanted to say too, somebody commented that local libraries limit the amount of time. That was an issue for me when I was teaching at St. Paul Adult Basic Ed, and we actually went around and physically met with the librarians in communities where we knew our learners lived, and showed them the distance learning curricula that we were using and asked them to waive their time limits if learners were working on those curricula. And they did. They actually did it. And then they reached out and said, some of our volunteers want to have training on these curricula so that they can answer questions from learners. So we were able to build a partnership with the libraries by making the request and the ask, and that turned into something much more than we originally imagined. So I encourage you to ask about that.
Tiffany mentioned Wichita Falls has a local business where people could donate laptops to them. The user would apply at the business, then the business would donate the refurbished laptop to help the user. That's pretty cool. Gracie, can someone tell us more about how to plan on rolling out online classes? We're interested in learning more. That might be a question you posed in the DL community of practice, Gracie, where we could capture everybody's ideas. And then Anne-Marie has got some comments here, how they've partnered with ISDs and community centers to use the labs after hours.
There are two more areas that we need to talk about, instruction and assessment. So here are the questions that are on the plan for instruction. So if you're following along on your own copy of the plan, make sure you ask questions about these prompts if you have them. Okay, so when we're thinking about instruction, I think the biggest myth that I always want to dispel is that distance will not require a teacher. It is so important for a teacher to be involved, an instructor to be involved. This actually was evident in one of the last research projects that Jerry worked on, along with me and Cheryl Hart and Destiny Long, where we interviewed many teachers across the country who were identified by their state directors as having learners that persisted. And this is what we learned. We learned that these teachers had these 6 characteristics. They made use of a good primary curriculum. They integrated resources above that, like a secondary curriculum or supplemental sort of OER, Open Ed resources. that they had a website that they used to coordinate all of these digital resources. They used some sort of blended or hybrid model. Many of them had use of an on-site lab, or they had creative access options for students who didn't have home Wi-Fi. And most importantly, they considered themselves lifelong learners. So I encourage you to check out the study. It has, this report actually has vignettes, scenarios, little use case scenarios that describe exactly how these teachers, there are 10 of them, how they implemented distance or blended learning, and then links to many of the technology resources that they used. So instruction is two things. It is communication and tracking that communication and progress, and it's being involved in decisions about the resources learners access when they're learning. Those two things together, that's what teaching online really is here. So when you're thinking about communicating with learners, you want to make sure, it's really important when you're writing in those plans, if you can make evident how teachers and coaches are going to have time to plan their communication with learners, actually like plan what resources learners get and then communicate with learners online. If you're going to expect teachers to be involved in distance learning, teachers actually need that time to support the instruction. Without it, it's just going to be the distance learning tool that is doing all of the instruction, which is not as effective, and it's not as engaging for learners, and learners don't persist as well. It is important that there are multiple ways for communicating, and those ways of communication align with the technologies that learners have access to and their comfort using them. So you could have office hours, you could email, you could have online discussion, video conferencing, all of these things should be in your toolbox of communication tools, and you draw on them based on what your learners need. Program NDC found out that it was really good to use Google Hangouts. It was better than a phone call because the teacher could share their screen and they could actually do some in-person instruction that wasn't like really in person, but it was like face-to-face at a distance. You could also use a tool to practice your contact with learners. If you can keep track of how many times a teacher is contacting a learner and by what means, overall your program is going to have more data that's going to help you budget and make decisions about how many teachers should be involved in distance and blended learning and how much time they should have to do it. I've seen programs just use a simple spreadsheet or a Google spreadsheet. This program in DC used a database product called Salesforce locally. So there are many ways to do this, but it is really important to have at least some awareness of the amount of time going into supporting these learners. This was just a form. There was a program that I worked with that had a support staff who was able to log all of this information into what they wanted to keep a central spreadsheet. So teachers kept their own log just on a piece of paper that they would then hand to the support person who did all the work logging. So there are many ways to do this, but it's really important to track these contacts. You really want to make sure students are aware of their progress, and you can do that through these check-ins that happen as you're communicating with your learner. The YWCA in DC is using badging. They're badging like after a student reaches out to a teacher 10 times. They're badging when a student reaches like X number of logins or has sustained effort across several weeks. So they're badging the affective and engagement aspects of distance learning beyond just like, oh, you're making progress in the curriculum. It's actually around the engagement stuff. And that has been very motivating for the students at the Y. Moving into assessment. So, there are many different ways to think about assessment. Basically divided into two things. So you want to make sure that you're thinking about the assessment and distance from the perspective of what your policies required. What is the testing frequency? How many hours are you gonna require before they come into test? And if they're distance, how are you gonna get them to come in to test? Also important is, even though learners might be working at a distance, is to consider options for both formative and summative assessment. You know, how are you going to adjust your instruction along the way by providing extra resources, with, you know, as dictated by formative assessment, and then how are you going to know they've made that progress? Distance learners are a diverse group of learners, and you know, I think we often default to using the embedded online curriculum assessment as the primary means for formative assessment and summative assessment for these learners. I'm going to suggest to you that that gives an incomplete picture of your learners' skills and knowledge, that any one assessment form is not awesome for all learners, and that you're going to have a much better idea of what your learner skills and knowledge are if you have, you know, if you employ a number of assessment options. So you might do a culminating activity, or you might keep progress checklists. Definitely do use those quizzes that are embedded in online curricula, but then also make sure you're meeting regularly with students so that you can ask follow-up questions to probe the depth of knowledge in what you're seeing online. Many programs have a competency-based model that aligns well with using a portfolio to demonstrate work. The state of Minnesota has a whole alternative adult diploma that's done at a distance and is portfolio-based, where you're actually collecting samples of student work that then inform what you give them in supplemental online instruction. And then, of course, just reviewing, glancing in at your students' online work is really important. So, you know, together, if you can draw on a few of these forms of assessment, you're going to have a better understanding of what your students can do and what their needs are. And you will help support their progress because you can adjust the learning materials that they have and really connect them. One other thing about tracking, as learners are you know, working their way through your program and you're keeping track of when they test, it's a good idea to actually document that someplace. So I'm sure you all have processes in place for your in-class students that you'll probably want to mirror with your distance learning students. So this is just an example. So for your reference, these assessment and instruction strategies are summarized. Some of them are summarized in this blog post, which is, again, an excerpt or a summary of those chapters of the IDEAL Institute or the IDEAL Handbook. Those blog posts are very short and they're really easy to share with folks. That you don't think have time to read a 150-page booklet, but need to have high-level, you know, just the high-level information. So I encourage you to check those out. It looks like people are interested in this badging idea, which is great. There's a question here about badging. Ashley asked the best way to get started with it. I think the first thing to do is to read about the different options for badging that are available. You know, the two that I am familiar with are Credly and Badger. And I believe both Credly and Badger have a free level of badging system available. And if not, they both have very low cost options available. And you can integrate these badges directly into a website. For example, like North Star Digital Literacy Assessment, students can earn badges from that too. And you could figure out a system where all of that gets integrated into the same website. This instruction area is one of the big changes that a lot of programs need to make in terms of staff time. It's a challenge. This is if teachers have adequate time to connect with their students, it's a clear indication that the budgeting for the program has been really well thought out, and that's what's made the time available. So it's a key shift in the culture of an institution. And so, you know, that's one of the reasons why I suggest wading in and going slowly when you're making changes. When we started way back when in St. Paul, I actually was the only blended learning teacher. And they started with my class and shifted it from a 5-day class from a 4-day class. so that I would have time to do the online support for those teachers, those students on the Friday. And it was a pilot. And from that pilot, we learned how to, make some changes to make it scalable to the rest of the program. So, you can't change a lot of these things overnight. You really do need to wade into it. In my mind, your next steps look like this. You're going to find that site plan if you don't have it, reread it, and think about what ideas you heard today that you want to take back and put in, and then start making those revisions. Really, if you're having a hard time knowing where to get started, at least identify one key area of that. If you think about that site plan as with multiple sections, think about one, at least, maybe start with one, innovate one at a time, and start thinking about how you might update that section by then considering all the materials and implementation resources that you're going to need to make those changes. And then, if required, start thinking about professional development that's going to help you fill your skill and knowledge gap, and identify where you're going to go for that support. So, it all starts with where you are and figuring out targeted places where you can innovate, things that are going to really have an impact for your learners in your program, but yet are reasonable and stuff you can reasonably do with the resources that you have. So with that, I will turn it over for some information from Texas.
Hi, everyone. This is Beth Ponder again. Lori, if you'd like to unmute, we have a question from Susan. How does the DL plan do on April 15th fit with the DL SOP? Do you only want revisions?
No, we actually want the entire plan because we've never collected them before. And so this will give us a much better idea of where we are as a state and where we need to start going from. We've never seen them, so we're asking that the entire plan be submitted along with revisions.
All right. Thank you, Lori. All right. So I just want to go over a few things in our last few minutes together. I'm going to share my screen, and I want to take you to our website. All right. This is brand new, launched today, so we have a whole new look. But I wanted to take you and show you where the DL resources are. So here at the top of the page, if you click on Institutes and then go to Distance Learning and Technology Integration, this is what the page is going to look like. And here in this first column are our distance learning requirements. That includes the state policy, the distance learning plan template that you're going to need, as well as the approved list of curricula. So I'm just going to go ahead and click on that. So this is what the approved list looks like when you go to the website. So all your information is here in one spot. Also, there's some really helpful links here for some additional resources, including the Digital Literacy Toolkit that Lori mentioned in the chat. I'm not sure all of you saw it. It's the third bullet there under helpful links. And here it is, the entire curriculum. You can download the entire thing, or you can download it by chapter. So a great resource to take a look at if you haven't already. And just a reminder on this slide that there are requirements for distance learning staff, including modules 1 and 3 of the DL Academy. Those are both available to you in the PD portal. DL1 kind of covers proxy hours, how are we tracking that, how do I put it in teams, all of the state policy pieces. And then DL3 is more on a longer course, about 10 hours worth of content, about creating a plan from scratch. And we're working on doing some revisions to that one, but just wanted you guys to know that remember that there are requirements and that we are here to help. And then if you haven't actually seen this already, we're having our 5th annual Technology and Distance Learning Symposium on May 1st. We'll be at ESC 20 in San Antonio. It'll be all day. We're going to start 8 and end at 4:30. Going to be some great sessions. Registration is available in the PD portal. It is free, so you just got to get yourself to San Antonio, but we're really looking forward to some really great sessions.
Well, thank
All right.
you, everybody, for coming to the webinar and having such an engaging conversation in the back channel. And there's my email right there. If you email me a question, I will try to answer it. So have a great afternoon. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Jen, for a wonderful presentation. We really appreciate you taking the time to visit with us here in Texas about what we're doing with DL. So thank you.